Hi guys, how are you? First off, I would like to say thank you very much for coming down. So I know today is free, but you're paying with your time and you're paying with your attention, and there isn't a whole lot more out there that is more valuable. So I'd also like to say thank you to Michelle and Christina from Iconic for organising today and making it happen. And hopefully you guys will get something from this. So my name is Jayson Moran and I am a coaching psychologist. So I specialize in helping entrepreneurs and professionals increase their impact by increasing their effectiveness. And I do this by looking at kind of three main areas and kind of three main questions. So firstly, I help people to better understand themselves. So we're looking at things like your personality, your, I suppose, core beliefs, what the balance is like in your life, maybe how you're performing in various aspects of your career, how you're performing in various aspects of your business. So kind of looking at that question, you know, who are you? Where are you at right now? The next kind of area I tend to help people in is to help them better understand what it is that they want. So we're looking really at what your goals are here. What is it that you want to achieve? Where do you want to go? So we might look at how those goals are structured. Do you have like a plan in place that makes it more likely that you'll achieve what you want to achieve? Are you clear about what it is that you want to achieve? And I suppose, are your goals in line with what's important? Are your goals in line with the person that you are? The third area that I tend to help people in is to help them better understand what's getting in the way to them achieving those goals. So those barriers can be both psychological and practical in nature. So common examples of practical barriers I deal with are things like getting organized, you know, having a system for your inputs and outputs, decision making. Do you have a model to make, I suppose, or to effectively problem solve? The final area I tend to help people in are more psychological barriers. And so they can be things like procrastination, motivation, confidence, or the topic of today's talk, stress. So what I'm going to try and do today is, I suppose our purpose is to try and understand stress a little bit better, have a look at what works, why it works, and explore maybe a little bit what might work for us. And the reason for this is, I suppose, different strategies are going to work for different people in different contexts, depending on their symptoms and depending what else is going on for them. So it's important to have kind of a range of strategies and to know when to kind of apply them. Okay. So what I would like you guys to do, and feel free to put this into the chat box if you'd like, but obviously I understand if you want to keep your privacy as well. I want you to maybe just take that pen and a piece of paper and write down some of the things that are stressing you out. What I'd really like you to do is pick one. And what we're going to do is we're going to use that one and we're going to apply some of what I'm talking about later to that one thing that's, you know, that main stressor in your life. Okay. So I'll just give you some food for thought here. So I'm going to talk about some, I suppose, common stressors in our personal life and our professional lives. So in our personal lives, our physical health, our finances, our home and our neighborhood, if we're not comfortable where we're living, or if our neighborhood isn't safe, for example, can be very stressful. Our relationships, and also children and family relationships. And I think with COVID especially, a lot of these have taken on kind of a new type of stress or a new level of stress. For example, people being let go. I suppose people having to work from home and people kind of on top of each other a lot. That can lead to stress in relationships. And also with your children and family can be a very stressful thing. I mean, one of the more stressful things I've seen one of my friends go through is having a sick child, for example. So all very common stressors. Professionally, we can get a little bit more specific. So things like your sense of control, you know, do you get to decide what you do? Do you get to decide how you spend your time? Not having any autonomy can be very stressful. Or workload, too much, obviously enough, but also the amount of surprising events. I mean, if you're constantly putting out fires, it can lead to kind of chronic stress. Do we have a sense of reward, or do we feel fairness in work? So I suppose, you know, are we recognized for when we do a good job? Do we get a slap on the back? Are we being properly rewarded monetarily? Then in terms of fairness, you know, maybe you feel you've been overlooked for a promotion, or maybe your opinion isn't valued in work, so you don't have any input, and that doesn't feel fair. Another area that we can often feel stressed in terms of work is by a sense of community. So I suppose if you don't feel supported and we don't feel a sense of closeness in work, it can be very stressful, especially because we spend, you know, like 8 to 10 hours a day, 40 to 50 hours a week in work. And so as a result, you know, that can have a really strong effect over time. And finally, if where we work isn't in line with our values or our ethics or the kind of job that we do. So for example, maybe you work in sales and maybe there's pressure on you to sell to people who don't really need it. Maybe that goes against your ethics and your values. Okay, so what I'd really like you to do is to kind of pick one major thing that's kind of stressing you out, and we're going to try and apply some of the rest of what we're doing today. Just bear with me 1 second. I'm just having a little bit of an issue with my spare screen and my chat, so I'm just going to pull up the chat here. Okay. So just bear with me 1 second. Okay. So as to what exactly is stress? Well, I'm kind of curious. Maybe you guys could let me know in the chat box. What do you guys think stress is? Like, what exactly are we kind of talking about today? I'll give you a second and I'll let you know in the chat box, please. Nervousness, says Mary. Very good. So it's kind of like a feeling, Mary, which is a fear of accomplishing a task. Okay, very good. I suppose that's very specific, Shiva Kumar. But I think fear is definitely something that's very much associated with stress, and I think that'd be one of the emotional consequences of stress. Okay, well, what I'm going to talk about today, adrenaline, very good. There's definitely a physiological side. I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. And negative emotions. I would argue almost, I suppose, not that I would argue, I think in terms of thinking of stress as a negative emotion, I almost feel like negative emotions can be a consequence of stress sometimes. Okay. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different definitions of stress today. So I'm going to talk about it from a physiological perspective. I'm going to talk about it from a psychological perspective. And I'm going to talk about it from a more problem-focused perspective. And the reason for that is I'm going to talk about different kind of strategies that we can use to deal with stress. And these strategies can be physiological, psychological, and more problem-based in nature. So I'll get into the first definition here, that I suppose stress is a biological response to a stressor. What I'm talking about here is what's called a physiological stress response. So the physiological stress response goes a little like this. So we see something in an environment that stresses us out, and then our brain sends a message down to a gland called the adrenal cortex that is over our kidneys, and this releases hormones, and these hormones lead to a series of body-wide changes. What's really interesting about that is you'll see that the arrow going back from the body to the brain is that our brain kind of recognizes these body-wide changes and that's part of how we figure out that we're stressed. So for example, we hear our heart racing, and so we start to realize that we're a little bit nervous or a little bit stressed. So this physiological stress response has kind of got there's actually two types. So the first is acute and the second is chronic. So acute is very, very quick. It's also known as the fight or flight response. And a hormone called adrenaline is released into your system, and this creates a couple of changes. So for example, your liver creates glucose, and that's to give you energy to fight or run away from whatever it is that is stressing you out. Your heart rate increases and heart flow increases, and this is to move that energy around your body, and your lungs open up to get more oxygen in, again, so you can kind of fight or flight more efficiently. Other things happen, like non-essential systems or systems that I suppose aren't being used to kind of deal with the immediate threat often shut down. So for example, your digestion stops, and this is often why you get butterflies in your stomach when you get very, very nervous. So the other type of physiological stress response, and this is the one we're more concerned with, is called the chronic stress response. And this is more slow and prolonged, and it's kind of silent. We don't really notice it as much. And the hormone that's released here is cortisol, and cortisol is very important later. We'll get to that. But cortisol has got kind of a number of effects, but mainly what it's doing is maintaining that stress response. So it keeps your glucose levels in your blood high so that you're kind of ready to deal with a threat. It increases your blood pressure so that blood keeps moving faster around your body. And it's also anti-inflammatory. So it means if you get cut or injured, you tend to heal a little bit quicker from it. And again, in terms of another thing cortisol does is it shuts down the immune system. And the reason it does that is, again, it's not deemed an essential system in terms of dealing with an immediate threat. So I suppose the acute stress response is like putting your foot on the gas to get fuel into the system in order so you can react. The chronic stress response is like when you're constantly putting your foot on the gas. And the issue with constantly putting your foot on the gas is sometimes you can burn out the engine, you can burn out the car. So why all the stress about stress? Well, it turns out it's got some really negative effects on our physical health and mental health. So this hormone cortisol in particular leads to increased blood pressure, increased blood sugar, and it also suppresses your immune system, as we kind of discussed. But this in turn can lead to some pretty nasty health issues. So for example, arteriosclerosis and chronic heart disease, and this is thickening of the arteries, because with that increased blood pressure, your arteries need to, I suppose, be stronger and thicker in order to deal with it. And this in turn can lead to heart blockages and heart attacks. It's also been very much linked to autoimmune and digestive issues, because as if you're chronically stressed, you're constantly shutting these systems down. It messes with the delicate balance of them. Chronic stress is also linked with bad physical health through negative health behaviors. We tend to drink more, we tend to smoke more, we tend to take narcotics more when we are stressed in order to kind of deal with the negative emotion often associated. We're self-soothing. In terms of our mental health then, well, it turns out that these high levels of cortisol has been very much linked to clinical levels of anxiety, depression, and being unsocial. And being unsocial itself can lead to some mental health issues as well. So what's going on here? Well, it turns out that cortisol is actually a little bit toxic to neurons in your brain, especially in particular regions. So it tends to overload them. So what happens normally is cortisol is released into your system, you know, when you get a normal bit of stress, and eventually the stressor goes away, the response ends. And then there's enzymes in your blood. And these enzymes break down the cortisol, make it go away. So it's not a problem anymore. When we're chronically stressed, though, what happens is cortisol is continuously released. And so these enzymes become overwhelmed because there's too much cortisol for them to deal with. So eventually the cortisol starts building up and building up and building up. One of the first things that happens when you've got an excess of cortisol in your system is it starts to damage the system in your brain and your body that measures and regulates cortisol. So your brain and your body doesn't realize there's too much cortisol there, so it keeps producing it. And so you get a positive feedback loop. And eventually this excess cortisol begins to damage regions in your brain, very much linked to anxiety and depression. Okay. So the next thing I want to do, again, I suppose the early section, what I'm trying to do here is all about increasing awareness. What I want you to have a little think about for a minute is, how do you know when you're stressed? You know, what are your symptoms? What are the giveaway signs for you that you go, oh, I'm stressed, you know? So I'm going to talk about some of the symptoms. So you might maybe want to take a few of these off, but I suppose the idea is they're going to maybe put your finger on 2 or 3 of your key kind of signs and signals. And these, I suppose, symptoms of stress are very much linked to our performance. And as part of the reason that I'm interested in it, is because these symptoms of stress can have really negative effects on our productivity, for example. So in terms of physical symptoms, things like muscle tension and headaches, and this is due because you're tense and because you're ready to go, eventually your muscles start to seize into place. And this can lead to headaches when you get muscle tension around your neck, for example, and in the muscle in the back of your head. Sexual problems, and they are linked to the overproduction of cortisol, which means we don't have enough resources left to develop sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen. We also tend to suffer stomach issues, dry mouths, and bowel and bladder issues. And again, this is very much related to our body shutting down that digestive system in order to deal with a more immediate threat. We also have psychological symptoms to stress. So racing thoughts and things going over and over and over in your mind. So it's almost like you're trying to solve the problem abstractly or solve the problem cognitively in your head. These are very much linked to constant worry and catastrophizing, where I suppose we assume the worst is going to happen. And also forgetfulness and difficulty concentrating are also symptoms of stress. And this is because often we've got a stressor in the background and it's kind of running around, you know, it's kind of taking up our cognitive space. We've difficulty focusing on what exactly is in front of us. More emotional symptoms are things like being irritable, being anxious, our self-esteem can get low, and our mood can get low when we're chronically stressed. And this in turn can lead to us feeling unsociable, because I suppose when we're feeling kind of terrible like that, we don't really want to have to deal with other people. And these are very much linked to the changes in the brain I was talking about earlier. More behavioral symptoms include things like, you know, we've got a shorter temper, we can be more unreasonable, which can really affect our performance in teams, for example. We also tend to drink more and smoke more. And again, this has got to do with self-soothing. We also tend to talk faster and talk more. We tend to babble on. And I suppose this is a good way of noticing stress in other people. We can also get very reactive when we're kind of constantly on the go and kind of jumping from one thing to another when we're chronically stressed. We can also be clumsy, and this is very much linked to the forgetfulness and difficulty concentrating. When we're kind of distracted by a stressor, we're not focusing on what we're doing, so we can knock stuff over and trip and stuff. Okay. So maybe just take a second and see if there's any of those that apply to you. But again, this is just kind of about increasing awareness around our stress. So then in terms of what we start to do about it, well, the first group of strategies I'm going to look at are physiological strategies. And what these are, I suppose, concerned with is creating what's called a relaxation response. So the relaxation response is like the stress response's good twin. So what it involves, your heart rate lowers, your breathing gets slower and deeper. As a result, your blood pressure drops, which I suppose all helps to kind of remove some of the negative effects of that stress response. We also tend to think a lot less analytically. So we're sitting much more in the moment. I suppose when we're relaxed, we're very sensory and present. So in terms of the relaxation response, what's very important is the concept of downtime. So you should be getting 1 hour of downtime a day, 1 day of downtime a week, and 1 week of downtime every 12 weeks. You know, you need to be taking a week's holiday really every 3 months. And just to point out with downtime, downtime is not sleeping. Downtime is like conscious time where you're consciously chilling out and relaxing. If you are feeling some of those physiological strategies, then you know what you probably need to be doing is about 20 to 30 minutes daily of some form of deep relaxation technique. So things like abdominal breathing and yoga are very good. If you go on YouTube, lots of videos explaining all these. Yoga with Adrienne I find particularly good as well, and they're good 20 to 30 minute videos. Another technique you can use is progressive muscle relaxation. This is where you tense each muscle group and then consciously relax it in order. And by tensing it and then relaxing it, this kind of makes a very deep relaxation. I'm going to recommend a book in a couple of minutes that will kind of guide you through that kind of stuff. And finally, another really good relaxation technique is meditation. And in terms of stress and stress relief and I suppose undoing the negative effects of stress, a particular type of mindfulness meditation called mindfulness-based stress reduction has been scientifically proven to reduce the negative effects of stress. So normally to do this course in Dublin, it's about €500, but this is one I've come across online, and I've done this myself. I highly recommend it, by a psychologist called Dave Potter. So he's a retired clinical psychologist. I think it's from Milwaukee. Because he's made his money already, he's put this up for free. And so this is like an 8-week course. So if you're serious about kind of reducing your stress, highly recommend this. It is a commitment though. It's 40 minutes a day for 8 weeks, but very much scientifically shown to work. And it's completely free. It's amazing. Yeah. The last physiological strategy I want to talk about is exercise. So I suppose with exercise, how that works, two methods or two ways. First off, it releases endorphins into your system, and these are feel-good hormones that kind of undo the negative effects of all those nasty stress hormones. Exercise is also very good in terms of reducing muscle tension. It turns out when you move your muscles more, they tend to feel much less tense. If you are going to use exercise and you haven't worked out for a while, you think you're out of shape, it can be a good idea to get medical advice before you begin. And it's always very important when you're starting out with exercise routines, start slow. It's better to do a little bit too little than too much, because you'll just get sore and you won't be able to do it consistently. And the key with exercise is to do it consistently. Because you need to be exercising for about half an hour, 3 or 4 times a week. And this is because if you're only doing it once a week, what happens is you feel stiff and sore afterwards, which can probably actually lead to more stress in the long run. So in order to get the most from exercise, what you need to be doing is you need to be exercising for 20 minutes where your heart rate is at about 60 to 80% of its maximum. So in order to calculate that, what you do is you take the number 220 and you take away your age. So in my instance, that's 182 beats per minute is my maximum heart rate. So it's 220 minus 38. And then what you do is you calculate 60% of that. So in my instance, that's 109 beats per minute. 80% of that is 145 beats per minute. So in order for me to kind of get the most benefit out of exercise, I want to be aiming to have my heart rate between 109 and 145 beats per minute for about 20 minutes. For me, that's a very slow jog, but it'll differ for everyone. So you can get really cheap Fitbits and stuff online. I think this one cost me 20, 30 bucks. And in order to measure your heart rate, etc. And once you kind of get used to figuring out, you know, what you need to be doing, you know, you don't need to be measuring your heart rate all the time. But this works as well. Okay, so maybe have a think for a moment about what physiological strategy might work for you. Maybe there's one you haven't tried. Maybe you've done exercise but haven't tried meditation. Or maybe you've tried meditation but you haven't tried some of those deep relaxation techniques. These 2 books, the Relaxation and Stress Reduction Workbook and the Anxiety and Phobia Workbook by Edmund J. Byrne, both list loads and loads and loads and loads of different physiological strategies you can try. I highly recommend them. You get these books on Google or on Amazon relatively cheaply. Okay, so the next type of strategy I want to talk about is more psychological in nature. And so the psychological strategies are kind of based on a definition and understanding of stress as something that goes on in our mind, and that stress is when we perceive the demands of a situation to exceed our ability to cope. So I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 strategies here. We're going to talk about some cognitive reframing, and we're going to have a look at some particular coping strategies. But before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about what's called the psychological stress response. So we just talked about the physiological stress response. So the psychological stress response really is what's going on in your mind when you're stressed. So it goes out something like this. So we have a stressor in the environment. Say we have an upcoming exam, and we ask ourselves a couple of questions. The first question we ask ourselves, obviously enough, is it stressful? Is it something I need to worry about? So say that exam is coming up, but it turns out it's not going to affect your grade for the end of the year, so you don't really care. So the answer might be no. However, maybe that exam is important, and maybe it decides whether you get into your next year in college, or maybe it decides whether you get into college in the first place. And so it's important. It's something that can be a cause of stress. So once I suppose, if we answer the question, is it stressful? Yes. Then the next question we ask ourselves is, well, if it's stressful, can I cope? And based on the answer to these two questions, then we have got what's called a behavioral response. We take action. So in terms of can I cope, I suppose if we come across something and we feel we can, so say that exam is coming up, but we've got a couple of weeks to study and we're confident in our ability, well then we can see it more so as a challenge. There's a chance that we can succeed and there's something that we can do about it. And so as a result of that, the behavioral response is often we take direct action, we do something about it. So maybe we make a study plan and we start studying. However, if the answer to can I cope is no, so say for example, that exam is coming up, but it's coming up in a few days and we don't have time to study and we have got a lot of other stuff going on, then because there's a high chance of failure and there's not really a whole lot we can do about it, then we see it as a threat. When we see something as a threat, then what we do is we develop coping mechanisms. So these coping mechanisms can be both positive. So for example, some of the physiological strategies like exercise and meditation that I mentioned before, or they can also be negative. So negative coping strategies include things like drinking, maybe smoking excessively, but avoidance is a very common one as well. And we'll get back to that a little later. So I want to kind of focus on these two questions first off in terms of whether we decide whether something's stressful or not and whether we can cope. So I suppose what might be nice for this is if you guys think of whatever stressor you have, and I want you to think about this kind of question in relation to that stressor, is it actually stressful? And the reason for that is that often we have unhelpful or unrealistic thinking patterns. These are also known as cognitive distortions. So for example, we often think in black or white, or what's also known as all or nothing thinking. And this is where, it's either great or it's terrible. And because it's either one or the other, sometimes it can be very stressful. So for example, we might think, if it's not perfect, then I've failed or I'm a failure. Another unhelpful thinking style we often have is that we disqualify the positive, or we have got a mental filter on where we only see the negative. So for example, imagine we got 90% in that exam. Someone would, who disqualifies the positive would say, oh, I got 10%, but I got 10% wrong, and focus on that. Another unhelpful thinking style we often have is what's called emotional reasoning. And this is because we assume because we feel a certain way that what we're thinking is true. So for example, you might think, oh, well, I'm anxious, so I'm not going to be able to cope with whatever the stressor is. Another unhelpful thinking style we often have is the overuse of shoulds and musts. So for example, we might have said, I should have studied more, I must work harder, and I have to get an A. The issue with this is this can often lead to a lot of guilt and frustration with ourselves, and these are very negative emotions which aren't going to help with our problem solving and with our, I suppose, motivation. I'll get to that a little bit later. Another thing we can often do is jump to conclusions, where we go 2 and 2 is equal 5, where we assume because something is happening, perhaps it's going to be bad. So for example, with that upcoming exam, maybe you're thinking, oh, I'm going to fail. And the big brother to this is magnification or catastrophization. And I suppose this is where rather than say, you're going to fail, not only are you going to fail, it's going to be a disaster, it's going to be the end of the world, and my college career is over, for example, in relation to our exam example. So what do we do about these unhelpful thinking styles? Well, one, I suppose, is to be aware of them. So maybe take a second and see if any of these are kind of applying to what, I suppose, that stressor in your life is. Now, they may or may not. But if they are, you can ask yourself some questions that can kind of help with, I suppose, reducing their impact. So for example, you might ask yourself, what's the worst that can actually happen? And if that happens, could I cope? So I think that's very interesting, especially if you go back to our exam example, because maybe the worst that can happen is that you fail the exam and, well, you have to repeat it in a couple of months. And if you can, you can probably cope with that. Another thing you can ask yourself in this situation is, well, maybe I'm just focused on the worst. What is the best that could happen? And then finally, you can ask yourself, what's the most realistic outcome here? And chances are the most realistic outcome is that it's somewhere between the worst and the best. Another one we can ask is very useful is to ask ourselves, am I jumping to conclusions here? Am I assuming an outcome that's not necessarily going to happen? And finally, even if it does look like something bad is going to happen, am I catastrophizing? Am I blowing this out of proportion? So see if you can apply any of those questions to what's stressing you out, and if they reduce some of the negative emotion around your stress. The next kind of, I suppose, important question in that psychological stress response is the whole question of, can I cope? And for me, can I cope has kind of got two main elements. One is based around self-belief, and the second is, is there strategies that we can use to cope? So in terms of self-belief, well, one question I find very useful in terms of, I suppose, figuring out if something is stressful or not, or whether it's something that we can handle, is to kind of look at how maybe we've dealt with similar challenges in the past. And if we've dealt with a similar challenge, then what do we do? And so what strategies can we use? And if we had a similar challenge in the past and it went badly, well then what could we maybe do differently? Yeah. Another aspect of self-belief is sometimes we look at problems and they're big and they're vague, and sometimes what we need to do is break them down and then break them down again and break them down into a manageable chunk. I really like the old adage, how do you eat an elephant? And that's one bite at a time. Sometimes when we're looking at that huge, big problem, looking at kind of one small aspect of it and something that we can actually take action on can really help with our, I suppose, self-belief and the feeling that we're able to cope with. Another thing that we can do regarding that can I cope question is we can have a look at some coping strategies. So those physiological strategies I spoke about earlier, again, they're very useful because you're reducing that, I suppose, physiological stimulation. You're allowing yourself to think clearer and straighter and to solve problems better, which I'll get to a little bit later. You can also look at getting some social and professional support. So, maybe you need to talk to your family or friends. Sometimes just talking about it and getting emotional support, and sometimes maybe more practical support. Maybe you can ask for help, if you can't speak to your family and friends, well, then maybe you need to get some professional support. So maybe you need to talk to a therapist or talk to a coach or talk to a mentor, again, and for both emotional and practical support. The final type of coping strategy I want to talk about are more emotional coping strategies. So emotional coping strategies are kind of very specifically aimed at, I suppose, reducing the negative emotion around a stressful event. One I really like is expressive writing, and this was developed by a guy called James Pennebaker in the late 70s, early 80s. And all you do with expressive writing is, in regard to stress, is you would write about your stress for 15 to 20 minutes. So you're writing about it in the first person. So you're writing things like I am, I feel, I will. And this is something you're not going to show anyone else. And so this allows you to write completely honestly. And don't worry about grammar or anything like that. You're just writing in a stream of consciousness. And this does a couple of things. One, it helps you get it out of your head and onto a page and so out. So it helps you express and so process the emotion around it. The second thing it does is by putting it down on paper, it can often make problems much more concrete. And what I really like about that is then that can kind of start the problem solving process. So what I like to do, I like to write about, how am I feeling, what's making me feel this way, and what can I do about it. I like this for a couple of reasons. It's free, it's quick, and it's super effective. Check out the book Expressive Writing, but if you give a Google as well, you'll get some really good expressive writing techniques online. Okay. So the third type of strategy I want to talk about more so are more problem-focused. And problem-focused strategies, I'm going to focus on a different definition of stress. And that stress is something that arises when something you care about is at stake. And we have a stress response in order to help us actually do something about it. And what you'll notice about this definition of stress is it's not very negative. This is a definition I got from a lady called Kelly McGonigal, who wrote a book called The Upside of Stress. Kelly's also got an amazing TED talk on this as well. I highly recommend you check it out. But the idea in the book is that we've got a stress mindset. And so there's two types of stress mindset. One is that stress is harmful. And the second stress mindset is that stress is enhancing. Now, what's interesting about this is that if they've done quite large studies, and what they found is that people who have a stress is harmful mindset, they tend to have worse outcomes in terms of their physical health, in terms of their mental health. What they believe is going on here is that because if we think stress is very harmful and what we try and do is avoid stress, then what we try is doing is distract ourselves from feeling stress, and as a result, we don't deal with the causes of our stress. So we use negative coping strategies, so things like drinking, smoking, but mainly avoidance. We can kind of put our head in the sand a little bit. And by avoiding our problems, this can often lead to more stress. So for example, imagine one of your major stressors is financial. And so as a result, you're ignoring letters from the bank, because it's too stressful to open them and deal with them. But as a result of that, maybe you're fined more and maybe your problems get a little bit worse, you know, so rather than dealing with them. An alternative stress mindset is that stress is enhancing. So it's where people see stress as something that motivates them and helps them, I suppose, deal with their stressors. And this tends to lead to better outcomes in terms of our physical health and mental health. And the reason for this is that people who've got a stress is enhancing mindset and aren't trying to run away from their stress, so to speak, tend to deal with their stressors. And this leads to two things. They tend to build resources and skills around, one, I suppose, their problems and how to deal with their problems, and two, with how they deal with stress and how they manage their stress. And overall, over time, this leads to less stress. Yeah? So what I want to talk about now a little bit is I want to go back to that psychological stress response for a second. And I want to have a little talk about this whole idea of whether we see something as a challenge or a threat. Because this turns out to be very important in terms of our problem solving and in terms of our ability to remove our stressors. So seeing something as a threat versus seeing it as a challenge has got, I suppose, engages different areas of our brain, which in turn leads to different types of motivation, lead to different focus, and lead to different ways of feeling, thinking, and behaving. So when we see something as a threat, so i.e., you know, the situation is going to lead to failure and there's nothing we can do about it, i.e., that exam is just coming up, we don't have any time to study for it, so we're probably going to fail. So what this sets off is the fear center in our brain. And so our motivation is all about avoidance. You know, I don't want to feel stressed. I don't want to fail. And so our focus then is all about avoiding pain and avoiding punishment. And this has got some effects on how we feel, how we think, and how we behave. So for example, we tend to feel anxiety and fear. Our focus tends to narrow in on the problem. We tend to zoom in on whatever is stressing us out. And this can mean sometimes that we miss solutions because we can miss the big picture. And in terms of behavior-wise, then we either get, you know, we get pissed off, we get a bit aggressive, we fight, we try to get away from our problem, we flight, or sometimes we don't know what to do, and so we freeze. This is contrasted with when we see something as a challenge. We see something as a challenge that we have available coping strategies. There's something we can do about it. So, you know, we have a couple of weeks to study for that exam. And there's an opportunity to gain. There's an opportunity for self-growth. And when we see something as a challenge, the reward system in our brain is engaged. And so it's a much different type of motivation. It's called approach motivation. And what we're really focused on is the reward on what it is that we want. Yeah. So different emotions are kind of brought up. So things like desire, joy, and hope, because I suppose hope is there because there's a chance that we can kind of get it, and desire and joy because it's something we want. And this causes us to think very differently. So we tend to creatively problem solve. So what happens is this, is we're here, what we want is there, and our brain fills in the gaps to get us there. Yeah. And then in terms of behavior, then this leads us to move toward and feel energized and, I suppose, get engaged with whatever our stressor is. What's very interesting about this is that we problem solve 47% more effectively if we're in a challenge mindset rather than a threat mindset. And so in terms of, I suppose, reducing our overall stress over time, in terms of reducing our stressors and dealing with our problems, this is pretty essential. Okay, so how do we get into that challenge mindset? Well, what we can do is one strategy we can use is we can use positively phrased goals. So normally when we're in a threat mindset, we're using what's called negatively phrased goals. And all a negatively phrased goal is when we phrase our goals around what it is we want to stop or avoid, or what it is that we don't want. So for example, if I was putting together this talk, and maybe a negatively phrased goal might be something, you know, I don't want to look stupid, or I want to avoid feeling stressed about the talk. And so this is all about what we want to avoid, what we want to get away from. And this leads to us feeling anxious and to narrowing in the problem, and then, you know, for that fight or flight response. However, if we use positively phrased goals, we can, I suppose, frame the problem as a challenge. And so positively phrased goal is we just phrase it around what it is that we want. So maybe what it is you want to achieve. Do you want to connect, or do you want to learn, you know? And so these are things that we can get and aim for. And so, for example, around the talk, I would have said maybe, you know, I want to create a talk that simply explains stress. I want to connect. I want to help people to understand and deal with their stress a little bit better. And maybe I want to learn how to manage my own stress and my client's stress a little bit better by doing the research for the talk. So what's very interesting about this is that when we frame things this way, when we frame things around about engaging and achieving and connecting and learning, then we actually generate beneficial stress hormones during the stress response. So for example, we create one called DHEA that's really protective in terms of our physical and mental health. It kind of negates some of the negative effects of cortisol when we see stress as a good thing and we want to engage with it. So people who do extreme sports, for example, they will produce a lot of DHEA because they're kind of chasing stressful experiences. Another beneficial stress hormone that we create is oxytocin. This is very protective towards our heart. It's also known as the cuddle hormone, and it helps us connect to other people. And so if our focus is on connecting with other people in a stressful environment, we create this, and so it can be very beneficial towards our health as well. And finally, our brains tend to be more plastic just after a stressful event. I suppose we're designed to learn from stressful events, which makes sense, you know. And so we can often think about how we can manage our stress better after a stressful event because we learn better. So I'm going to leave you with this. So in terms of, I suppose, a problem-solving strategy I really like, I think it's very important to focus on what you want, not what you fear or not what you're afraid of. And to do this, you can create some positively phrased goals. So you might ask yourself, you know, what is it that I want? And how can I use the energy from stress to get it? So whatever your stressful situation is, maybe just take a second and kind of go, well, okay, this is stressing me out, but what's actually important in the situation? What do I actually want? What's my positively phrased goal, basically? Another way we can frame it is we can ask ourselves, you know what, if you're in a stressful situation, how can I connect with others? You know, how can I maybe help other people who are in the stressful situation with me, or how can other people help me? And finally, we can focus on learning from our stress. You know, we can maybe ask ourselves afterwards, you know, how can I manage my stress better? Or what could I maybe do a little bit differently next time to improve it so it's not as stressful? Okay, so stress is a huge topic. I'll be doing a Q&A afterwards. I can only cover so much. These are lots of other topics that are very essential in terms of stress. So if you guys are not stuck for time and you're knocking around afterwards, I'd love to have a conversation and love to have a chat around any of these topics. So just to conclude, we talked about increasing our awareness around stress. So trying to figure out, you know, what are things that are actually stressing us out and what are my actual symptoms of stress? And hopefully you were able to put your finger on one or two. I talked about the physiological stress response and the negative effects of cortisol and how we can use relaxation, meditation, and exercise in order to reduce that. I also talked about the psychological stress response, and we looked at reframing and various coping strategies like expressive writing in order to reduce, I suppose, the psychological impacts. And finally, I talked about problem solving in terms of reducing our stressors. So we talked about our stress mindset and then how we can set positively phrased goals to put us into that, I suppose, challenge mindset versus a threat mindset. Okay, hope you guys found that useful. If anyone wants to get in touch afterwards, I do one-to-one coaching. I run a meetup called Practical Psychology where I do a lot of talks like this. I've also got a YouTube channel and I do speak in public events as well. Sorry, a bit of a typo there. So I'll send an email to everyone afterwards if anyone wants to get in touch about any of that. And I'll hand you back to Michelle.